Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
The U.S. bags 2 more tankers. Welcome to the Wednesday edition. As the U.S. seizes an oil tanker that escaped the Venezuelan blockade somewhere south of Iceland before another sanctioned vessel in the Caribbean was seized, with President Trump now announcing plans to control future sales of Venezuelan oil. And there's more today. The president just now calling on social media to ban institutional investors from buying single-family homes. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Tyler Kendall, who's in for Kaylee today live in Washington. This latest move here by the president is moving stocks, Tyler.
Yeah, Blackstone, other home builders' stocks are sinking on the news. And it read to me like a direct message from President Trump to those members on the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee, because he wants Congress to codify that. And we have a member of one of those committees coming up, Congressman Bryan, Steil of Wisconsin.
That's going to be a really interesting conversation. We had a lot of other things we wanted to ask him about. And this just emerged in the last 15 minutes, as you heard live here on Bloomberg. Moving stocks around, heritage homes falling to session lows. As you mentioned, Blackstone taking a hit on this, but also housing stocks like Lennar and like Invitation Homes, the biggest owner of single family homes for rent. All of these are being impacted at a time, Tyler, when affordability remains the biggest issue in Washington.
Right. And you were talking about this last hour on Balance of Power, but it is very clear that this White House wants to coalesce around a message of affordability. And perhaps this could be a preview to the State of the Union address that we could get from President Trump, since he says that he'll detail some more of what this could look like during his address to Davos in a few weeks.
So we're workshopping the State of the Union for sure. This is moving markets, obviously, but so too is our activity in Venezuela. We'll be looking at oil prices as well. And we're going to talk to Colonel Wayne Sanders, of course, from Bloomberg Intelligence, about everything we need to know about the seizure of these tankers and apparently the delivery of some 50 million barrels of oil, as the president said this morning.
We had just in really the last hour, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt outlining a little bit more. She says that the U.S. is selectively rolling back sanctions to facilitate the transport and the sale to the global oil market. But in terms of a timeline, that's still perhaps an open question. Here's what Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters on Capitol Hill earlier.
I'm not going to give you a timeline on it. We wanted to move as soon as possible. But we didn't expect this would. It's been 3 days since this happened, 4 days since this happened. So I understand that in this cycle and society we now live in, everyone wants instant outcomes. They want it to happen overnight. It's not going to work that way. But we're already seeing progress. With this new deal that's been announced and more deals to follow, you're already seeing how the leverage the United States has over those interim authorities is going to begin to lead to positive outcomes.
Which brings us to the headline on the terminal. U.S. seizes 2 more ships as Trump tightens Venezuela quarantine. One of these ships we chased halfway around the world. This is the one that escaped the blockade a couple of weeks ago in the Caribbean and made it almost all the way to Iceland, where we intercepted and boarded the ship earlier. That's where we start our conversation with Colonel Sanders. He's back with us today. It was one of the first names we asked for. Wayne Sanders, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Defense Research Analyst, and of course, retired Army Colonel. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I can't imagine what it's like to be on these boats when the helicopters come down on the deck. Can you give us a sense just of what it's like to be the captain of one of these vessels when you see America coming in your rearview mirror? What do they do when they land on the boat?
So first thing, if you're that captain and you actually see the U.S. Coast Guard coming from behind you, you then see AC-130 gunships flying over your head, along with something called an P-8 Poseidon, which is a sub-hunter.
Yes, okay.
These are all going around you and the U.K. is also involved.
So you're in a real busy space all of a sudden.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then all of a sudden now you are going to have a helicopter that's coming and you're having U.S. troops board your vessel to be able to take over. But they did it in a great way in terms of the title and authorities on how they actually did it.
Okay.
The Coast Guard being involved in this instead of U.S. Navy personnel boarding the boat allows it in terms of that law enforcement, the maritime law enforcement piece that's really going back into the sanctioned indictment for this.
And that sort of ties to what we saw in Venezuela, right? When we hear the administration talk about executing a law enforcement action. Can you just talk to us about how critical that difference is when we're talking about actually going out, seizing what it means for the implications for our military?
No, absolutely. So these were sanctioned vessels that dealt with black market oil, crude oil. And so as such, right, the difference between the Coast Guard and the Navy, if the Navy does it, it ends up having a much higher level escalation on the public stage. So the fact that the Coast Guard was the one that was following this vessel, they originally tried to board the vessel, a couple weeks ago, and then started following it, and they waited, the U.S. waited to board this until this point. Becomes key because it's not an act of war at that point in time. You are looking at it more in terms of the law enforcement side. The blockade stays in put. The skipper that was boarded a couple weeks ago, as well as then today, you've got the Marinera as well as the Sophia. So they're doing this under the law enforcement side. The Coast Guard is playing a pivotal role in this.
Really interesting. This video that we're showing on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube is wild, taken with night goggles, I guess, or night vision here, as you see them climbing the stairs up to the bridge of this ship. And you see right now, if you're watching, the helicopter coming down on the deck of this boat. There they are climbing the stairs. Colonel, did they knock, or do they knock the door down?
Well, I think at this point in time, they're looking for rules of engagement. Were probably very clear before they actually boarded that boat. So it's probably a no-knock warrant.
A no-knock warrant
that allows them to be able to go in and be able to do that. They've already provided entry at that point in time. They're already on the vessel. So at that point in time, what is going to provide them with the most force protection to be able to, and they always do it with the least amount, right? Escalation of force. So they're going to start at that lower level. And if you're that captain on a vessel, I think at that point in time, you've been followed by the Coast Guard. You've got the gunships ahead. I don't think you're going to resist, right?
Leading up to this, we saw what appeared to be an escalation by Russia, right? They had sent a submarine to escort one of these tankers. Does this action by the U.S. risk inflaming those tensions between the U.S. and Russia? What do those sorts of communications look like between Washington and the Kremlin? Are there communications?
There were, because Russia came and said that they were concerned about the fact that the Coast Guard was following along. But the U.S. comes in and talks about the fact this was a stateless vessel up until that point. This is not a this is not a Russian flagged vessel. When they avoided when the Marinera, back then actually was called the Bella One. When the Bella One tried to get down to the blockade, when they turned around, they immediately started to paint a Russian flag on the side, and then they provided the registration paperwork to Russia. Now, Russia normally actually inspects and does formal pieces before they actually register a vessel and flag them underneath theirs. They did not do that in this case. So then when the Russian submarine is coming up, they're the ones who actually provided a Title 10 military action, if you will, compared to the U.S. Coast Guard Title 14 or under Title 18 under law enforcement authorities. Both of those. That escalation actually came from Russia. So I think when looking at the political calculus on that was, hey, look, we still boarded the vessel using our law enforcement authorities. But yes, the fact that the Russian was there did have to play into, okay, is the Russian submarine going to engage?
So what do we think about that? Do you mention that P-3 sub Hunter? Do they bug out when they see hardware like that when the United States is around, or does that draw submarines to the scene?
Well, I think at that point in time, I don't know whether the indicators and warnings for that submarine knows that they're actually being seen or watched or tracked by a P-8 Poseidon. But those sub hunters do end up playing a very critical role.
Wow. See, I was looking forward to this conversation all day. We just learned a lot from the Colonel. There's only one, Colonel Sanders.
Really fascinating. Wayne Sanders, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Defense and Research Analyst. Thank you so much. And to continue this conversation, we're going to bring in our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick is from a partner at Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. So, Rick, 2 more vessels. Is this the kind of leverage that the U.S. keeps talking about when we hear officials say that they have this pressure campaign to have Venezuela go along with the U.S.'s wishes in the country?
Yeah, it's really kind of complex to follow the reporting on this. One day, yesterday, they were talking about dropping these sanctions and opening up for business as normal now that, we have freed Venezuela. And then in the same news cycle, we're chasing down these 2 vessels and boarding a third. So, it is a pressure campaign. Clearly, the U.S. felt that it needed more pressure on the current Venezuelan junta that's ruling the country. And we don't know why. We don't know what they have or have not done for us. But I think this is going to continue to break through the headlines. And even though the president was trying to change the subject today on housing pricing, I mean, we're going to be talking about Venezuela and chasing down, tankers, because it's a really sexy, interesting story. And, Donald Trump doesn't stand a chance of getting in the way of this one.
Well, Rick makes a point here, Jeannie. It's like a Tom Clancy novel every day around here. What do Americans think when they see that video we were just showing of such a level of projection of American power and the risks that come with it?
I think they see it as an example of how incredibly strong and powerful and disciplined our military is. And this capacity we've seen in these operations in just the last, 9,600 hours are incredible. And I don't think any American doubts that. But I do think, as you think about the risks, there are questions about why are we doing this? And politically, the president has not done a good job of explaining why this is in the interest of the United States and of Americans. And Rick just mentioned the issue of housing, which the president is trying to turn to today. This is what Americans really care about, is what is this going to do for us? And, when Donald Trump talks about the millions, billions of barrels of oil that are going to come in, he doesn't talk about how flooding the oil market like that will reduce the price. And that's not good for the oil market. Hear about that more from oil executives on Friday. So a lot of the messaging on this beyond the actual military operations is really muddled politically, and they're going to have to wrap their head around it. Otherwise, Americans see a president who's focused on other countries and other parts of the world and not the very big challenges we face here at home.
Well, we can talk about those challenges and we can talk about housing because, Rick, to pick up on the headline that we ran at the top of the program, President Trump saying he would move to ban institutional investors from buying single-family homes. We've seen a lot of executive action from this White House, but this is an instance where he is calling on Congress to codify this policy. Is this something that could potentially actually get bipartisan support in this era of Congress?
Sure. I think that anything that really goes to the heart of, the basket of issues around, prices is going to find attraction with both Republicans and Democrats. It's going to be very hard for everybody to set aside their partisan interests in an election year. So that being said, it all is going to depend upon what that policy is. But I think, when you look at the contributor to inflation and affordability that housing prices have represented really quite for some time since 2020. Since 2020, the Case-Shiller index on housing prices has gone up 68%. I mean, that has squeezed so many people out of the markets, and now you have corporations taking advantage of the inefficiency. What did Donald Trump say today? People should own houses, not corporations. That kind of simple phrasing is going to be attractive to both Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, that is a good line, Jeannie. Is that a line that Democrats wish they were already using? Because this is moving markets here. This is going to be a very big deal for these companies. And I just wonder if we should assume that this will bring housing prices down, because the president has actually expressed concern about raiding people's nest eggs, which is their home.
That's right. I would say I think the Democrats have been well ahead on this. How many decades have we been hearing from Democrats that corporations are not people? And this speaks to the fact that Donald Trump once again has sided on the populist side of this, and I think rightly so. But I'm not convinced that there's not going to be pushback constitutionally and legally on this. How can you tell an institution, if indeed these corporations are legally defined as people, that they cannot purchase what they want to purchase? That's something that Republicans have talked about for an awfully long time. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays legally. But I do think the president, the White House promised towards the end of last year that this was going to be a big year with aggressive housing reform plans. He talked about 50-year mortgages, all these kinds of things. And I think this is the first sort of shot across the bow on that. I think it's a good one for him. But again, It's going to be supported by Democrats. I'm not so sure how Republicans who talk about corporations as people are going to feel about the idea now that they can't buy homes. And by the way, does that mean they can no longer fund campaigns? I certainly hope not, but the president hasn't said anything about that either.
No, I don't know if we're going to be doing that today. Rick, we all thought the same thing when this post hit Truth Social, and that was the State of the Union. This is the type of thing that a president would roll out in the big speech before the joint session of Congress, and we know that the invitation is likely soon to go. When you step back and think about that framing of the president's second year here, how much of the State of the Union is going to be about this, domestic affordability, versus geopolitics and the Don Roe doctrine?
Well, I can't imagine the Don Roe doctrine, or at least, his corollary to the Monroe doctrine, isn't going to be a central focus of how he believes he's helping America by being able to establish, these relationships in a place like Venezuela, and look at how much we've gotten already out of it. 50 million barrels of oil. Can't help himself. So I think there will be a litany of that. And by the way, right, we've got all these looming tariffs that are supposedly delivering trillions of dollars to the federal government. I mean, I think that we're going to see an accounting of how rich the country is based on what he's done. And I think these kinds of things like the housing device that he's come up with is a way of trying to protect himself from looking like he's leaving people behind.
Fascinating moment here, and we expect we'll be hearing from the president later on today about it. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, thank you both. With the EO and maybe legislation forthcoming, we'll talk about it later with Congressman Bryan Steil here on Bloomberg. This housing story that Charlie was just referring to, it's moving stocks across the board, from Blackstone to Pulte to Invitation Homes. We learned about it on Truth Social. For a very long time, the president writing, buying and owning a home was considered the pinnacle of the American dream, the reward for working hard and doing the right thing. But now, because of the record high inflation caused by Joe Biden and the Democrats in Congress, he says that American dream is increasingly out of reach for far too many people. And so, as I read down here, he says, I'm immediately taking steps to ban large institutional investors from buying more single-family homes, and I will be calling on Congress to codify it. It is where we start our conversation with Congressman Bryan Steil, the Republican from Wisconsin who chairs the House Administration Committee and serves on House Financial Services, with us now live from Capitol Hill. And Congressman, it's great to see you in the new year. Thanks for joining us here, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm assuming this is something that comes out of FinServ. I'm wondering your thoughts on this, where legislation might be sourced, and is this an idea that Republicans can get behind?
Well, far too many people can't afford the homes that they could have a generation ago. As we have seen interest rates continue to stay high, mortgages are more difficult to get into. We know we have a significant supply problem. I look forward to seeing the president's speech that he's previewing in that message when he's in Davos about exactly what his plan is. But I think it's across the board imperative that we work to make it more accessible for families to get into a home. I think the two key policies that we should be working on here on Capitol Hill are working on policies that reduce inflation so the Federal Reserve can bring down interest rates, and then working on increasing the housing supply. As we increase total supply, that is going to be our best tool to ultimately bring down costs.
But for clarity, Congressman, would you support a bill banning institutional investors from buying single-family homes as outlined by the president? And can you give us any insight into whether or not this was a surprise? Was this dropped in Congress's lap, or was House Financial Services, for example, given a heads up beforehand?
Well, there's been obviously a lot of discussion for a long time about whether or not institutional investors should be buying single-family homes and what the implications are into the broader cost structure across the country. The president, in his message moments ago, said he's going to provide additional details in a couple weeks. I look forward, like many others, to seeing exactly what that would look like. Again, to me, the biggest thing that we can be doing in Washington is reducing inflation to lower interest rates and working to increase total housing supply by removing, in particular, regulatory red tape. So I look forward to seeing the proposal, evaluating it when we do, but working broadly to make sure that we are working to make housing more affordable and accessible to families in the United States.
Well, it sounds like you need to hear more Congressman. What's this process going to look like? Because I'm assuming with the companies that we're seeing move here, from Blackstone on down that I mentioned, there's going to be a massive lobbying effort against this. Do you expect such a debate?
Well, this debate has, in many ways, been ongoing for months. I think there is a lot of concern about what is driving up housing costs, making getting into, in particular, a new home for young couples more and more difficult. I think there's a lot of policies that have been on the table. The Financial Services Committee moved forward a housing package just before Christmas with broad bipartisan support, showing that even here in a period of time of hyperpartisanship, we're able to move legislation to bring down the cost of housing. I applaud the president for engaging in this space and look forward to seeing the proposal.
Something else that we have our eyes on today in Congress is this vote on potentially extending the Affordable Care Act premium subsidies in your chamber. Yesterday, President Trump told House Republicans to be, quote, flexible on the Hyde Amendment, which has become a flashpoint in this debate. That's the policy barring federal funding for most abortions. Do you agree with the president that Republicans should be more flexible when it comes to the Hyde Amendment?
I don't think Americans should be required to pay for abortions. I think the Hyde Amendment is an important amendment that protects Americans who do not support federal funding of abortions. That said, I think there's a big opportunity to make sure that we're lowering the cost of health care for all Americans. And that's what's so important here. So many Americans can't afford and utilize the health insurance, even if they have health insurance. There's a lot of proposals on the table. Republicans have moved forward with a number of them, things such as PBM reform, that we should be working collectively together. Yet we often are seeing just really aggressive positions from Democrats on this position that's making it difficult to find that broad common ground that I think does exist in many ways to lower the cost of health care for all Americans.
So where do you think this is going, Congressman? We've got this discharge petition that Tyler refers to that's going to bring a floor vote, I believe, tomorrow on extending Obamacare subsidies. There is not a companion bill in the Senate. Is this just a show vote, or is this the beginning of a renewed effort to find a bridge to a different plan?
A discharge petition is really a blunt force instrument to force a debate on any given topic. As I have often said, inside the Democrat-drafted subsidies that are going to insurance companies, there's significant waste, fraud, and abuse, and there's Biden administration memos from their Treasury Department outlining how this is being abused by insurance companies. And so at a minimum, we would need significant reforms. I think broadly, there is space where we can work to lower the cost of health care for all Americans. And I think, again, PBM reform, HSAs, in empowering individuals to be purchasing that insurance rather than empowering insurance companies, as the Democrat legislation has done, is the best path forward.
In the final minute we have you, Congressman, do we have any insight into when President Trump's State of the Union address is going to happen? Is it on track for the end of February as we get some previews from him in his post today?
I don't have the scheduling in front of me, but I would assume that it will be in that time frame. That's when it's historically been. And this is a great opportunity for the president to come to Capitol Hill, not only to explain to the American people in clear terms what we have already accomplished and how Americans will see more income in their paychecks as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill and the tax reductions, about the success we've had at securing the border, but also about the work that we still need to do yet this year and some of the heavy lifts that we have in front of us to continue to get this country back on track.
All right, Congressman Bryan Steil, Republican representing Wisconsin's 1st District and chair of the House Administration Committee. Thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg. And we're going to bring back in our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, to extend the conversation. Rick, let's pick up on healthcare because this is going to make some headlines this week. Where do you actually see this debate heading? Is this, at this point, a messaging ploy, or can we actually get some tangible policy this week?
Yeah, I think we're going to get tangible policy this week. Thune has made it clear on a statement to the press on Monday that he's making progress on a bipartisan bill to address ACA. I think it basically looks at a group of reforms that they want to apply. Minimum premium payments would be included in that. It would be only a 2-year extension of the ACA subsidy rather than a 3-year that's in the House bill that'll be voted on tomorrow. So my guess is that you'll get leadership from the Senate, a bill will pop out, the House will get some momentum behind this discharge petition in a vote tomorrow, and you're going to see quick action when it comes. But I think everybody's pulling now together with the idea that they don't want to go through another government shutdown where this is on the table.
Mm-hmm. So does the turnout on this vote tell us what happens next? Jeanne, if this is a convincing number when this passes, assuming it does, as we saw on the discharge on Thursday, does that compel John Thune to take another look?
I think it will. And I think John Thune has signaled that he is going to take another look. I think the real question is going to be, if he does that and you get something out of the Senate, what then does Mike Johnson do? He'll have to put it up for a vote, presumably, but we just have to take a step back and think about what he is asking so many Republicans to do. And that is going to be sold by Democrats and others as support the ACA, something that many of them baked their entire career on trying to get rid of. And now they are being asked to do something that's going to be very hard. So Mike Johnson is going to have himself in a position. It is possible something gets through, but it is, I think, a heck of a way for Republicans to have to start the year. And oh, by the way, if they don't get this done, it is political suicide, to use Tony Fabrizio's point, because they are then facing a midterm with rising health care costs, people kicked out of the marketplace, and showing the American public when they own Washington, they can't make our lives more affordable. That's a huge problem, particularly for those in purple states like Mike Lawler, where I am right now. So a big problem if they don't get this done.
Rick, in our final minute here, how is this made even more complicated by the fact that there's now a 2-vote margin in the House through at least March, when we're then expecting Marjorie Taylor Greene's seat to be refilled? How does that change the calculus of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it means that whatever happens has to be bipartisan. They're not going to win anything on a party line vote at this stage. And I do think there are a lot of Republicans, Jeanne mentioned Mike Lawler, who they have actually been outspoken about trying to resurrect this ACA subsidy for their own good, right? Because they've got to run in a district where that's going to matter.
Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our great panel. Thank you both. Bloomberg Politics contributors, helping us get to the point on a couple of major stories that are developing before our eyes today. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are watching these stocks move, though, housing stocks and financials, which were already not having a great day on this news from the White House. The president wants to ban institutional buyers from the single-family home market. Look at Blackstone, down 5% here. I can go on. Invitation Homes down over 8%. Lennar, like many home builders, down about 2%. Norah Mulinda used to cover the home building space for a living. And while we typically talk about broader market trends with Norah, we wanted to zero in on this. And she joins us from World Headquarters in New York. Norah, how much of a disruption would this be, especially if Congress were to codify the president's EO that he is signing to these companies that are so deeply invested in this space?
Well, Joe, we're certainly seeing the market reaction today. We're seeing records for Lowe's, for Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent. All these companies that essentially specialize in purchasing a home and then flipping it, renting it out, and they're essentially betting on long-term growth, rent increases. And we did see this actually really coming into the market a lot more after the pandemic. You were seeing a lot of institutional investors coming in. But what the broader question has really been, and what it seems as though President Donald Trump is trying to get at, is the fact that a lot of average Americans have had a hard time purchasing homes, given the fact that rates still remain high, given the fact that prices still remain high, and they're competing against institutional investors. So when you see what's happening in the market and the fact that this is rattling it, it's not surprising, because a lot of these companies, that's their entire business model here. But it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this can actually be something that's pushed through Congress, or if it's just an idea right now as to whether or not we'll actually see something more concrete.
Well, according to Congressman Bryan Steil, at the moment, it sounds like Congress needs to hear a lot more details before this happens. But Norah, we also wanted to talk geopolitics. This redhead crossed the Bloomberg terminal moments ago. The Venezuela state-owned oil and gas company does say it's in negotiations with the U.S. to sell crude. We know oil companies are going to be meeting privately at the White House this Friday. Can you just tell us what the reaction's been like?
Yes, I mean, I'm looking at crude oil right now. It's hanging around $56 right now, and we're looking at WTI for that one. But this has really been interesting as we're continuing to follow geopolitics. I mean, that's really what's been the focus much of the beginning of this year. We're just a few days in, but that's certainly been what's on the mind of a lot of investors. So you're really seeing them thinking about how they can best position themselves in this environment and what that means for the broader implications economically for the U.S. and, of course, these foreign countries, and where you can really fit in on this trade. That's what we're really seeing right now, Tyler.
Just quickly, Norah, this is really interesting as we watch oil prices decline. This is really not going well for green energy stocks, because presumably the progression of green energy would slow if we have all this cheap oil and gas sloshing around. First Solar is down 10% right now, or $25. NextEra Energy down 3%. This is the other side of that coin, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to continue to watch this trade. I'm looking at shares of First Solar down by about 9.6%. So you're certainly seeing the impact on that space in relation to just the proper oil side or companies that are related in that space. I mean, we were looking at Exxon just a couple days ago, and it's interesting to really see what's going on in terms of the actual implications that we're seeing for green stocks right now.
Absolutely.
All right, Bloomberg Television's market correspondent, Norah Mulinda, thanks so much for giving us the latest. And we're going to extend this conversation and bring in another expert, Patrick McHenry, former chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and former Speaker Pro Tem and a Bloomberg contributor. Thanks for being here. We want to start with President Trump's post here calling for Congress to codify this idea surrounding housing. You used to chair House Financial Services. How would this actually work in practice? Would you be waiting for the White House to reach out and give you details? Is this something that Congress is going to have to start from the ground up on? What could we actually see happen next year?
First, I would wait. I think it's a terrible idea, so I would wait. I would wait quite a while. And I would have hearings. I would love to get the feedback on the legislative text on how you execute this policy in a legally binding way. But I think you have to get into the question of the cost of housing. And the question of cost of housing, we've spent a lot of time on in Congress, and there are no simple answers here because most of the issues are regulatory at the state and local level. And much of that deals with land use policy in the most liberal domains in the world, in America. Not in the world necessarily, but in America. And they're the ones that have the most restrictive covenants on what you can do with land and how many people can be housed on that land, how many domiciles you can have. And so that is a big driver of housing stock questions. In areas where you can build, like Houston, you can build and housing is affordable. Even though you're rapidly growing. And in areas where you may not be rapidly growing, like San Francisco, housing stocks continue to rise at a more aggressive pace because of their restrictive local policies. So this is not all a federal issue, frankly.
It was only moments after the president put this post on Truth Social, we heard from, of all people, Bernie Moreno, not Bernie Sanders, who writes on Twitter, millions of young Americans have been locked out of the American dream. Donald Trump is fighting back. I will introduce legislation in the Senate to codify this into law. We just had Bryan Steil on, who used to sit on your committee, the Republican from Wisconsin, who did not fall in behind this. He said he needed to learn more. Is Bernie Moreno on an island, or is he speaking for the Republican Congress?
I think you're going to have a mix of Republicans that are either for it or need to learn more.
Is this a conservative concept?
No, actually, what I've found is some of the most populist Republicans, they would call themselves, get their ideas out of the progressive left. This comes out of the progressive left. This is something that Maxine Waters and I debated in the House Financial Service Committee in previous Congresses. It is not an effective course of policy to have a meaningful impact on the cost of housing and affordability of housing. In fact, the numbers of this, the numbers affected by larger groups of ownership structures for housing, individual houses, is rather low in America. It's a very, very small percentage. And so I don't think this has a grand effect. It does have a big statement, though, that the president does care about housing affordability, thinks it is meaningful, and is something he should speak to. This goes into the question of affordability and how the administration is going to address it. Yeah. They are going to be aggressive here, and they are not going to be dogmatic. And I think that's the key takeaway here, both for the market, but also the electorate. For the midterm.
Well, I was going to ask, do you think Republicans have a policy problem or a messaging problem? Or maybe you think no problem at all, but when we see what happened in November, Republicans losing a slew of elections, you see polling sagging for the president, but importantly, consumer sentiment also going down. And we know voters want to hear more about what the president's going to do when it comes to affordability.
Well, the overall economic data is rather strong. The president is right about that. But you get into what is underlying the growth of the market. It's around the hyperscalers. It's around AI deployment and the build in AI. We see that in GDP numbers. Without AI and the AI build, we'd have a flat GDP, not a growing GDP. Mm-hmm. So you see this in under the hood, if you will, and that is much more problematic. The additional piece is you're 1 year in on administration, not even 1 year in on the effects of their policy. So the effects of the president's regulatory relief, the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the work that they're doing with the administrative state and paring down the federal workforce and the expense of the federal government does have an impact over time, but it does take time for those to impact voter sentiment and their feel. But you can't take the Biden message and say what you're feeling is not justified. What the voters are feeling is still a real thing that has to be dealt with by the political class. And if you don't respond to it, well, you fall victim to voter sentiment, and they kick you out.
Interesting. Well, I want you to bring us into the Speaker's office. We heard from Mike Johnson earlier today. Not a fan of extending Obamacare subsidies with regard to the whole affordability issue, but needs to figure out a way to fund the government before the end of this month. And it sounds like he's pretty optimistic. Here's the Speaker from earlier.
This week, the House is going to advance, as you heard, the next set of the FY26 appropriations bills. We're going to continue our strides to restore regular order around here and get back to the appropriations process. We're not totally there yet on the full, what you would fully call regular order, but my, have we pushed this boulder up that hill.
Now, we're not ready to start playing the regular order drinking game yet, which is very popular around here at Bloomberg. But in all seriousness, how does this shake out? You get a short-term CR so these minibus bits of legislation can pass? Is it as simple as this? We were talking about maybe another shutdown a couple months ago.
Sure, and I don't think you take the shutdown off. I think this idea that there's 0% chance of a shutdown is absurd.
Wow.
So how do you get through this? Well, it's incumbent upon the Senate to produce bills. That is the key benchmark here. You have to have 60 votes. The reason why we had a government shutdown is because the Democratic minority withheld the votes for the Republican majority to pass appropriations bills. You needed 60 votes. Yep. Republicans don't have a majority. They have a 53-seat majority in the Senate. That is the crux of the problem. And so for the House to make it their problem is not correct. They should wait, see what the Senate can do, and then pass what the Senate can do. That is actually the way for you to have a continuing resolution and to have minibuses that are structurally okay enough to pass. So I do think my view is you will have a resolution to government funding. It will take months, though. It will not be done at the end of this month. It will be get a few minibuses together with an extension of the rest of government and do it bit by bit. And at some point, you'll have a continuing resolution for the rest of government till the end of the fiscal year. Obamacare and health care is a different matter altogether. For Republicans to make it their problem is really not politically smart. Healthcare policy in America today has been almost entirely written by the Democratic Party. Medicare, Medicaid, designed by the Democratic supermajorities. You have Obamacare, same. There aren't Republican votes for those big pieces of federal legislation here. We have 10 million Americans that are affected by the loss of these additional subsidies under Obamacare that were put in place during COVID. Yep. Their expiration does not mean that these individuals are directly affected. It means the states may be able to take action to backfill some of this. But for Republicans to step into the narrative of rising healthcare costs, well, they were rising before. They're actually no better now post-Obamacare than before Obamacare. And people like their healthcare system less today than they did a decade and 2 decades ago. So the problem's the same, and Republicans stepping into this and trying to take ownership of it, well, that becomes a political problem, not a change of policy.
Final 30 seconds that we have here, though. Is this going to result in tangible policy this year when it comes to healthcare? And you hear the president talking about giving more money to consumers. We saw Bill Cassidy's law for HSAs ultimately fail. Is there appetite to make real changes when it comes to costs and healthcare? The
House can pass the president's health initiatives to give money directly to individuals. The Senate doesn't have the vote. They don't have the votes to do that. So the Katie Britt group in the Senate is the one to watch. If they can come to some conclusion within the next month, that will be the going concern. That will become the law of the land. If they cannot come to some conclusion, and I don't think they will, because it's not in the Democratic Party's interest to help Republicans out of their own bind that they've created for themselves, then we'll see you at the ballot box, and we'll see what happens.
Patrick McHenry, aren't you excited for the State of the Union? Is that a mudslinging fest this time or what?
Oh my gosh. It's going to be a shouting fest is what it will be.
Fasten your chin straps. Once again, Bloomberg Politics contributor, former Speaker Pro Tem, the great Patrick McHenry. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthews. See you on the late edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg.